Welcome, 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 welcome. All is a blessing.
Come back home to Africa. She's calling your name through me. Come back home to Africa. The fatted calf and golden rain are waiting for you once again.
Greetings.
Come back.
Peace and love, joy and prosperity. Come on in. Welcome. Come on in.
Coming back to you. Out of bondage is now I am free. Come back home to Africa. She's calling your name through me. Come back home to Africa. The fatted calf and golden rain are waiting for you once again. Come back to you. I'm longing for my family. Coming back to you. Out of bondage, and now I am free. Da, 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 da.
Welcome. Greetings. Greetings. Marcani. Odabo. Mawoni. Come on in. Come on in. Come on in. Am I all clear? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Come back home to Africa. Come back home. Come back home to Africa. Come back home.
Divine, all blessed, peace and love, joy and prosperity, revelations and manifestation. You are now sitting live with the Divine Prince, Pan-African spiritualist, practitioner, author, and advisor, Elagun Oloye Hoodoo Obeah Bokur, sharing with you in all things spiritual, mystical, metaphysical, cosmic, evolutionary, revolutionary, healing, and holistic from a Pan-African Hoodoo world spiritualist perspective. understand that all is truly and indeed a blessing. If you can just see beyond the veils, for it's all just an illusion and a test and one of the greatest divine mysteries of this life cycle. This is my constant prayer, my mantra, affirmation, reverberation, reiteration, and it is my ever living reality. It is crucial to the very foundation of my understanding, my teaching, my walk, my works, my ultimate demonstration along this divine, all blessed life path and journey. It is how I, the Divine Prince, make sense out of all that we are challenged with here in our daily existence on Mother, Father, Earth. And it is my personal place of power and understanding, the place from where I begin, the place from where I realize and crystallize all my endeavors, understanding that I and I alone create and co-create my divine destiny, and I alone create and co-create my divine all blessed reality. And so it is. Ashe, Asheo, Ashe. Greetings, each and every one of you. Thank you, as always, for taking the time out of the middle of your day to be present here in this squared circle of gods and goddesses at high noon U.S. Central Standard Time, now on multiple platforms. Blog Talk Radio, of course, at blogtalkradio.com/the-divine-prince. This is indeed where I began this journey some dozen or so years ago, back in the day on Blog Talk Radio. And eventually I migrated into YouTube Live. And we experienced a few technical issues over the course of a year with YouTube Live. And then Kiona introduced me to some new technology. And so now I can broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, several other social media platforms, all at once, all simultaneously. And so I'm grateful for this second episode of that simulcast broadcast and the opportunity to reach out to a greater audience, a bigger audience, to meet you where you are and address your questions, concerns, comments, requests here in this live platform. I am truly always honored and grateful for any opportunity that I can stand up with and in my ancestors. Any opportunity to be able to acknowledge just one more day, one more breath, one moment in time space, to truly step into our destiny, who and what we are, understanding that the seed first planted through the spirit realm, but also through that which is our physical realm, our physical body. And so I often say that the spirit is more real than anything we can imagine in the tangible, physical, material realm. It is more real, it's more evident, it's more usable, it's more lasting, it has a greater sense of longevity when it is first seeded, when it is first planted from within the spirit realm. Your magical books talks about laying up treasures in heaven as opposed to laying up treasures on earth. And we know that the magical book, as with many magical books, often have many meanings, many interpretations, many directions in which a message can be looked at, depending on where you are in the process. And so we know that the idea that we can plant a seed first in the mind, in the consciousness, in the heart, in the emotional plane, and then expect it to become real ultimately in the real world. It's just as real as our attachments to words like success and love. What is success really? What is love really? Beyond the words and the power that we give the words that we associate with it. Is it measurable? Can it be counted? Is it something that we indeed expect to see in some physical, real world manifestation? And that's where the illusions come in. Love, relationships, marriage, partnerships, baby mama, baby daddy, all this other kind of elusive stuff comes into play, when love should be pure, when truth should be pure, when power should be pure and untainted. So I welcome the opportunity to walk in the truth of the ancestors who laid the foundation upon which we now stand. I welcome the opportunity to acknowledge the powers of Sogbo and Bade, of Shango, Olokoso, and Yansa, and Oya, thunder and lightning, wind, sudden change, transformation, weather. I count it all weather. And so even in the spirit of this season, the season of the coronavirus, it's just right now one more act of weather that we need to protect ourselves from, that we need to prepare for, that we need to anticipate as we continue to walk our journeys. Understand, our journeys have not ended. Our mobility has been limited to some degree, but our journey has not ended. Our pathway to our destiny has not ended. Indeed, this is just the beginning of a new opportunity for us to be new things, to be expansive, to be creative, to recreate ourselves more in line with the image of our most divine creators, but of course in line with ourselves. I welcome each and every one of you, both individually and collectively. I can get off on a tangent sometimes and forget my duties in managing the show. I welcome each and every one of you from whatever platform that brought you here to Revolutionary Hoodoo New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes today. Greetings, Andrea. I thank you so much for your early participation and activity in the show. Greetings, Kiona, our beloved moderator. Please do show respect and follow the rules as it relates to how we operate and interact among each other in our chat. But more importantly, make sure that you type your questions, comments, and requests in all capital letters so that I can see them, and Kiona can help me to identify them, and so that I can identify them separate from your general greetings and salutations and comments that inevitably show up in the chat. Also, be mindful that my Blog Talk Radio is active, and you can call me now at area code 845-277-9143, 845-277-9143. When you're ready with your question, comment, or request, do press the number 1 on your telephone keypad. That virtually raises your hand for me and lets me know there's a caller in queue. And then I can at least bring your voice audibly into the square circle of gods and goddesses here in this space. You are, of course, welcome to use the chat platform wherever you are viewing and participating right now, and type in capital letters so that we can see and distinguish your commentary from the post that you need me to respond to. And I appreciate the comments about the quality. Without your feedback, I won't always know if there's a glitch. Sometimes you can catch the glitch before I can even be aware that there is a glitch. So from wherever you're listening from, if there's a distinction outside of StreamYard, let us know where you're listening or viewing or chatting from. And of course, if there's any audio or visual complications during the course of the show, make us aware of that as well. And thank you, Andrea. Wash your hands, whatever you do, wash your hands. I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to criticize. I'm not going to particularly analyze the idea that we are still having to say that this late in the game, that we're still, having to question people's ability to discern what's essential in this state of the game. It often reminds me of many of the challenges that we are faced with in spirituality and religion, in the act and practice and walk of spirituality and religion, in the business of spirituality and religion, in the instruction and the ministry of spirituality and religion. And that is people interpreting, i.e. information, news, knowledge through their own cipher. Through their own cipher. In all things, I say, if you're not clear, you can't expect anything else to be clear. You can't expect those who are observing you from the outside to necessarily get a clear message if you're not clear. And my favorite tool for clarity, my favorite tool to remind us about clarity is indeed quartz crystal. It is indeed quartz crystal. It reminds us to be still, to be clear, to vibrate, to resonate in our truth, to be clear about our truth, and then ultimately to take that truth out of the realm of the mist, the M-I-S-T, the mist, the fog, and bring it into the realm of reality. You all know it would never be a good broadcast if something wasn't delivered in the middle of the show. So give me a moment to bleach my hands, and I'll be through it momentarily. It kind of reminds me of when I'm on the phone with my mom, or I'm teaching or instructing something, with the caller. And the minute things get really good, or you get a good segue going, there's always that interruption. Sometimes that's just the weather. Sometimes that's just life. And other times it's active powers, active forces seeking to sort of derail you from your journey. And that's why it's always important to be clear, crystal clear about your motivation, about your foundation, about your attitude, about your reality, your truth in terms of anything that we say that we're committing to, that we're learning, that we're exploring, that we're incorporating as part of our life. So we must always start with self first. What are we eating? What are we drinking? What are we putting in our body and as fuel, as energy, and then expecting outward manifestation to come from that, not just in our physical outward manifestation, our ability to walk, run, be athletic, but also our emotional output. What we eat affects our emotions. It affects our ability to think and to process. And so when we then want to introduce new languages, new cultural practices, new traditions, new ritual applications into things, we expect to then get that, often in the middle of a storm, often in the middle of chaos, often without us stopping long enough to make any kind of real adjustments at all. So I welcome your questions today, your comments, your requests. Please, if you will, you can. Okay, Keon is alerting me that the phone lines for Blog Talk Radio are not right. Oh, wow, I'm muted. Beloved, I didn't mute it myself. Okay. I've been muted since the beginning of this show. For 20 minutes, I've been muted on Blog Talk Radio. Welcome, Kiona, beloved. Thank you so much for being my second set of eyes. Sometimes, it takes more than one person. It takes a village, not just to raise a child, but to raise a technology idiot sometimes. So your line is now open, beloved. Kiona 323. I had myself muted. For 19 minutes, I had myself muted. It's a lot, it's a lot to pay attention to on this side of things. So thank you so much for
and talk.
And thank you, yes, and talk and stay on topic and not sound like you just rambling. and be present and want to respond to my participants who are interacting, and then get up and run and answer the door in the middle of things. It's a lot to pay attention to.
And reach your hand.
Yes, yes. And remember to
But
wash
you're
it.
looking good.
Thank you kindly. All is a blessing. All is a blessing. We should, we all should. And forgive me if I sound a little corny right now. I saw this repeated back earlier today on one of the morning programs, that you've got to keep your routine. You've got to keep your routine. You can't let this corona epidemic get you off your square, move you out of any sense that you're still walking towards your destiny, prevent you from accessing the same things that you still might need to access to live every day, to move forward in your life every day. I know for some of you who might be essential workers, or just might be parents, with a heavy load, and things always seem to be, from one thing to the next. You never had a rest, you never had a break, you never had a vacation. I know there are others now who, work the 40, the 50, the 60-hour jobs outside of the house, and are not doing that. And so you might need that first week, like a vacation, to sort of download and get some sleep, and catch up on your napping and that sort of thing. But just like a summer vacation, just like taking a break from any career or any schooling schedule, you really have got to then get back into some sort of schedule. And so maybe you're not leaving the house now to go to work, but now that can be your prayer time, your study time, your meditation time, your time before your altar, if you will, your time now to start an exercise regimen, or incorporate and bring something new that you've been wanting to bring new, holistic, health-wise, wellness-oriented, spiritually oriented, bring that now into this present reality. But you got to get up and get dressed. You got to get up and get cute. You got to get up and put on your clothes, even if you aren't going anywhere, even if you have no immediate destination, or your body and your spirit will begin to respond to sort of that sedimentary pattern. I am witness number one to that. In a normal setting, I spend way too much time in this chair. In a normal setting, I spend way too much time sitting and in consultation and being on the floor and doing divination. So I have to remind myself, under normal circumstances, to be active, to exercise, to move around, to stretch. So I know how easy it is to sort of slip into those patterns. Don't be so quick to eat up everything in the house. Some of you have more groceries in the house now than you've ever had in the house, more food now than you've ever had in the house, preparing for an extended stay, preparing for, the meals that your children, for example, would have otherwise have been getting at school. And now you're having to prepare that, and take care of that at home. So don't forget yourself in the process. And for those who are apt to make excuses to not address the self, this is now the time to examine self. And I like the elements as it relates to how we operate, how we think, how we sort of reason in the world. The mist is one of my favorite elements. Storm is one of my favorite elements. And I do well under pressure. I do well under sudden change and dramatic shifts, in climate and or lifestyle. And so we're all having to re-examine, re-look at how we live, how we do things now, under new conditions that are going to be around for a while. I know we're still getting mixed messages about, how temporal or temporary this really is or is not. But this will be around for a while. Our mathematicians, our scientists, our medical professionals understand how long this is going to take. So with any foresight at all, we're looking at least a year before they get any sort of uh, uh, viral soldier that can attack this or bake this or control this in any way. So we must be willing to do the work. We all must be willing to do the work. I know it sounds like I repeat myself every day, but it's a divine truth that in ignoring the work and hoping the work goes away and hoping that by the time you come out of your nap this might pass, is just not realistic. It's just not realistic. And so when you come out of that altered state, you still come back to the reality. You still come back to what we really have to face. Thank you so much, Kiona, for helping me to unmute my mic. Greetings, Neophyte Bokur. Thank you so much for stopping in on your journey. Sean Wynn, thank you so much. Danette Gibbs, I'm appreciating you right now. Kiona D. Carter, thank you so much for moderating our live broadcast here. We appreciate your assistance and keeping the chat moving, but also keeping me moving in terms of paying attention to what's happening. Greetings again, Andrea. Have I greeted everyone? Sadie, baby, Buology, greetings. Thank you so much for coming in. And please do remember to type your questions and comments in all capital letters so that I can see them and distinguish them from the other communications. Yeah, Kiona asks if someone wrongs you. She says she has a tendency not to forgive them and remove myself. Can that cause blockages? It absolutely can. And particularly with people who might not otherwise find themselves to be so forward or so aggressive. Particularly people who tend to take the passive role. Particularly people who tend to deny. But particularly people who tend to fix, repair, nurture outside of themselves and not to nurture the self. Because that energy, like all energy, is eternal. That energy has to go somewhere. It has to go somewhere. I'm more likely to say what's on my mind quickly, even if I'm not clear about what's on my mind. I'm more apt to question: am I wrong? Am I getting the wrong message? You know, is there some breakdown in communication here? I think I heard you say, you know, I'm more apt to confront than to hold on to, because I come from a background of holding on to and the detriment of what that can then turn into. And so when it doesn't immediately manifest outwardly, you know, in your love life, in your career life, in your personal life, in your social life, in your finances, you know, it can show up in other areas, in your health, you know, and how you're processing stress, for instance. And so there are all sorts of stresses. Some stress that's healthy stress. There's a creative stress that's healthy for some people. There are some people who are indeed wired for consulting, wired for counseling, wired for ministry, wired to be EMS or essential frontline, you know, medical workers who can then healthily process the amount of stress that they are personally under, but then that they absorb from the client, from the patient, from the person that they have to nurture each and every day. So someone who's not trained in nurturing in particular, you know, just the average codependent, the average enabler, the average loved one, family member who just may not necessarily know what to do with you and your stuff, not you, Kiona, but a particular individual and their stuff, and they can't speak up, they can't ask for help, they can't say, okay, I can't handle this, but let me get somebody who can. That energy absolutely will begin to affect you in your physical body, but also in your spirit body. Sometimes people equate things to be the curse, to be bad luck, to be from the outside perpetrator. to be the victim, if you will, in this world of ghosts and goblins, and not taking into account how real our shadow is, how real the shadow world is. Uh, we all have sort of had that experience where, you think you heard something, you think you felt something, or you believe you experienced something just out the range of your vision. But by the time your body catches up to it, there's nothing there. There's nothing evident that anything happened. Sometimes we experience that even in our sleep state or in your dream state, and you may suddenly find your soul, your spirit, rushing back into your body, and you wake up, in a sweat and breath irregular, and having been sure you heard something or felt something or experienced something. It's again a physiological outward symptom of something that we all experience on some sub level, some spirit level, some energetic level that we all share in common. And so if we don't do something with that joyful energy, if we don't do something with that excited energy, if we don't do something with that negative energy, it has to go somewhere. And it's funny how many of us, those of you who have children, um, how easy we can sort of identify these things in children. We understand that if children get too much sugar, or if children get too much carbohydrates, or children are allowed to sort of sit on and contain too much energy, that can have negative repercussions. And so we create outlets for that. We create outlets to stimulate that. We create controlled, safe environments, for the display of that. And even as we grow into adolescence and even into adulthood, some people view athletics or sports or working out as an extension of their ability to exercise energy, but both negative and positive energy. Um, we all have heard, I'd rather go to the gym, and hit a punching bag, than hit my partner or my spouse, or to blow up, at work. There's always both literal and figurative ways to see and interpret and make sense of what I'm saying to multiple audiences, to multiple ears that might be both hearing and viewing us, but also experiencing you all's questions through what I'm sharing back on the show. So holding on to anger, holding on to resentment, holding on to unfounded fears can all be detrimental. Um, it can all have a toxic, negative repercussion, literally and figuratively. If not on your physical overall sense of well-being, then on your inner sense of well-being. And it's hard for anyone to tell me that they're spiritual. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care what your path is. Or lack thereof. I don't care what your philosophy is. It's hard for anyone to confess spirituality, to confess religiosity, to confess consciousness, even if you want to separate yourself from the religious spiritual language, and then not be able to self-identify. And it's real easy to see ourselves, self-identify, to see ourselves, and then see that reflected back to us in the world, through people around us, through our environment, through inanimate objects, particularly when it's positive. It's somehow so much easier to see into that positive dimensional space, or at least the realm of dimensional space that inhabits how we want to see ourselves, how we wish to see ourselves, how we would hope to envision ourselves, in an immediate future realm of dimensional space, as opposed to what's truly real and organic. And that's why in many cases we need a teacher, we need a leader, we need a mentor, we need a tutor, we need someone to sort of walk us through the process. How open would you be to your child saying, you know, I'm self-taught. I can learn this math and this English and this earth science on my own. Just point me in the direction of the library. And if you had an erudite child, if you had a child who was well versed in the Dewey Decimal System, who, like my mama instilled in us, who you took to the library every Saturday from the time they were born, and you went from reading to them and then them reading for themselves, you might make some room for that. Some of you are homeschooling, and particularly now, everybody's homeschooling, right? And so you might make some room for that. But there still has to be some curriculum. There still has to be some, you know, organized, structured sense of what needs to be accomplished, that the newcomer, whether it be the student, the young student, or the older student, needs some sort of roadmap in which to follow, in which to sort of move them along, so that you have checkposts, so that you have road marks, so that you have a way of determining your progress, because even that can affect you spiritually, mentally, emotionally. When a student or a child gets no positive, gets no positive reinforcement, only hears you can't do, only hears you're stupid, or you're an idiot, or why can't you figure this out, then they begin to believe that outer language. That outer language then becomes their inner language, and then reinforces their own inner language, and then becomes their ultimate reality as they move forward. So even the adult, even the 80-year-old student, the 70-year-old student needs some road marks along the way for progress, for assurance that they are meeting the task at hand to gain access to the information and or skill or knowledge that one might be seeking. So even if one is resistant to the outside teacher, resistant to eldership, resistant to mentorship, and really believes they can only do a quote unquote self-taught, self-initiated, self-walk journey, you got almost every book in the Library of Congress to read and to get through and to decipher and to make sense of on your own within a short amount of years to do it in. I don't care if you have 100 years, 120 years of life. We often talk about books, by the way, on this show, and I always say that, you know, the number of books that I would suggest, the number of books that I've read, just to try and put that in a list. It's hard for me to even grasp my own mind around that, because the minute you say, you know, these are the 10 books that are important, you know, then those are the only 10 books that some people are going to read. And then they're not even going to read them thoroughly. Do you read the cliff notes? Do you read the index? Do you read the table of contents? do you read the introduction when you read a book? How much do you pay attention to that? Of how much of it of importance is that information to you? And those are the sorts of things that our teachers and our professors have us do, would want us to do, would guide us through in the course of a course or schooling or an instruction. And even then, we expect them to already have a set, understood curriculum. And so they're still sort of zeroing in on, bullseyeing in on very specific points of reference, while leaving the details up to you to sort of go through or not go through. And it's often on the quiz test, the pop test, the final exam that sort of trickery comes into play. Area code 832. Welcome, beloved. 832. Your mic is now open. Who's calling and where are you calling from?
Hi, it's Sandra Bruner, or Think Bruner.
Greetings, beloved. Thank you again for being active in the show and participating and calling in with your questions or comments. What's going on today? How
I
can we?
love it. But as I missed it, I still go back and have to watch the video and like kick myself because I wasn't able to come in.
Yes, and I say it all the time that sometimes, particularly before when we experience a great deal of buffering, people would miss whole passages, whole minutes. I can tell by the minutes
Yeah.
at the end that whole passages would be, missing from the show. But I also strongly advise even initiates, even my godchildren, even my students, even people who are getting a reading from me to absolutely document and record. Document and record. That means take notes and audio or visually record, depending on how we're doing the session, because no one is a computer. Even of the highest IQ, you're not going to remember every nuance. You can't stop and ask questions before you say them out loud and still document and record at the same time. So it's real useful to do them both. So in this format, of course, we're asking our questions and we're interacting in sort of an organic way. But then there's always an opportunity to go back and listen in the Blog Talk Radio archive, or even view in archive and hear, even from a different understanding, something that we did not catch right in the moment. Right in the moment.
Right. Right. I love catching up with your shows. Sometimes I binge watch them. If I missed one yesterday, I would go way back like years and watch stuff from a while back. But I had a question because I've been experiencing phantom smells, but it's not like normally it would be perfume. Like with what I've researched, other people have experienced smelling sweet smells, perfume, or like their grandmother's perfume, or cinnamon, or tobacco. I smell seawater, and I've gotten one reading with one specific woman about it, and she whenever it happens, I feel like it's malevolent. I don't feel like it's a benevolent spirit. I don't feel like it's like a great thing. I feel like it's a warning, but I can't see anything. And I've meditated on it. I've tried to do a thing or two. I brought it to my ancestors. She thought that my ancestors wanted seawater from me, but I don't know exactly where it's coming from. I've tried to look it up. I don't know if I should just get with my ancestors and wait for the answer, but I want to know what it is. So is there any advice that you have for me in order to try to figure out what exactly spirit is trying to tell me when I smell seawater? Because I could be in a completely landlocked portion of the city. So I'm in the middle of South Park and I'm smelling seawater. And I'm like, we're nowhere near the ocean. You know what I'm saying? So I just wanted to know what your take was on something like that happening.
It is, we say ancestral. Sometimes when we say ancestral, it's always about, I talked about this briefly yesterday, how we negate the African context of reincarnation when we discuss ancestors. So we think about Big Mama, Big Papa, those that came before, but because of how we sort of have been educated in the West, it's hard for us to sort of envision how ancestry plays into that. And even in African culture, a baby, a child is not named often for several days until you really have some opportunity to gain a sense of personality and character. Is this child brand new, which is often not the case. You hear me say the storehouse of souls, for the most part, has been almost depleted. So there are very few of us who come in who don't have a past life, a past earth experience, some past earth manifestation. So sometimes we sort of negate that or get that crossed up in the discussion and the instruction about ancestral work and divination. But you are experiencing more of like a past life regressive sort of thing. And it's malevolent to you because it has a negative connotation for you. Much like watermelon has a negative connotation for me. I can't stand the smell of watermelon. I can eat honeydew. I can handle the smell of honeydew, but the smell of watermelon since childhood has made me nauseous. And in my attempts to sort of make sense of that, I did everything from um, past life regressive work to other forms of therapeutic, meditative, and guided meditative work. And it always took me back to sort of this dark period in terms of my past life regressive history, where I'm unable, as desperately as I want to. Now, listen, this may not sound, make sense to some of you, what I'm getting ready to say, but I've always desperately wanted to connect to slavery. And if I was there, had a past life in it, if it existed from within my family, I wanted some memory of that, some knowledge of that. And until this day, I've never been able to sort of have that experience, except for this whole issue around watermelons. And it's malevolent. It's not benevolent. It's not positive. And so through years of work, I've come to the understanding that I was lynched in a watermelon patch. And so I indeed, we hear this a lot on social media. I indeed would have been one of those that not only would have been lynched, killed, murdered, but it would have been done so several times over. I don't seem to have ever survived beyond 20, 19, in terms of me trying to really pull, some past life regressive memory from slavery in particular. I have other thoughts and impressions and visions around antebellum time in history, antebellum South, but not quote unquote slave memories, indigenous memories. I have maroon memories, which would imply some connection to slavery, but none directly in association to me specifically. So I may have even had an ancestor who was born during maroonage and may not have been born necessarily within the confines of active bondage, but existed still within that time period. And we now know that there are stories that speak to that, little known stories, but documents, not stories, history, documents that speak to that. Saint Milo, who I acknowledge on June 19th every year, was a Maroon leader, one of the larger Maroon leaders here in the New Orleans East area. So much so that there's still to this day areas that are named after Saint Milo. And so we're talking about a guy who came in and out of enslavement at liberty. Would go off into the swamp, go off into the maroon camps for long periods of time. But if they needed resources, the resources was in town. And so they would come back in town and get them. We also know that there are documented cases where slaves would escape on the weekends or during holiday periods or during seasons when a particular master or a particular family would be away during a particular time and would go see their broken wives or their broken family members. I shouldn't say broken wife, broken family members, or go see, the mother of their children or their own mothers, in a faraway plantation, in a faraway camp, risking being violated for doing so, risking some level of punishment for doing so. So I often think about what level of punishment are we really willing to endure? What level of outing are we really willing to endure? To say that we're operating authentically and truthfully and organically in hoodoo, root work, conjure, voodoo today. Hence the wind behind my constant, reference to, do your mama know you doing this? Do your grandmama know you doing this? Do your pastor know you doing this? Do your imam know you doing this? Because we still are sort of walking in interdimensional space. We're not under the threat of the lash of the whip anymore. You're not under the threat of literal lynching anymore for acknowledging African roots, for acknowledging indigenous roots. So why then in 2020 do we still hide it? Why then in 2020 are we still dabbling and dibbling in it? Why then in 2020 are we still saying that, you know, the system is oppressive and everything about it is oppressive, but yet we walk right into it willingly, voluntarily, for a check, to keep the lights on, to keep the bills paid, to maintain a job, maintain a career. I know this is something that I've had to confront, and I've had many people along my journey who've also had to confront that. You know, when your spirit and your religion and your belief now really gets in between, you know, you and your job, or you and your livelihood, or you and your familiar or social connections that you believe that you have. How strong are they, you know, when you stand up in your truth? How strong are they when you can speak your mind? How strong are they when you can really be organically and authentically who you are each and every day of the year, you know, without any reservations or concerns? Quiet as it's kept. That's what some of you all's problem is with me. I am so free, you can't stand it. I am so free, you can't stand it. I'm living in voodoo 24 hours a day, every day. And I'm not at odds with my mama. I'm not at odds with anybody that matters. I'm not at odds with in terms of my ability to eat and to live, you know, and it's a place that many of us want to eventually be. Once upon a time, we thought that's what retirement would look like. You know, so I'll just commit 50 years and then I'll spend, you know, my remaining years, you know, traveling the world or spending time with my grandchildren, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And we know even that plan, that program doesn't really exist. Not for many people, not anymore. Not only for the most privileged. And when we think of the most privileged in a modern context, we're now talking about self-employable individuals. Self-employed individuals, but also individuals with skills, talents, knowledge, degrees that afford them, allow them some mobility other than the traditional as it relates to what they do, how they operate, how they live. Whoever would have thought today an attorney would have seen a future in television, or a judge, you know, in television, in media. Once upon a time, you were just an attorney or you were just a judge. And we saw that as white collar. We saw that as kind of square. We saw that as a limited, you know, few and not really of any entertainment value. I'm going to say somewhere around the O.J. Simpson that all kind of changed. Isn't it the same time CNN was created during the O.J. Simpson trial, and news became entertainment, not just about gaining access to information? And this is a great segue into something else I want to talk about today, and that is the still prevalent propaganda, rumors, nonsense as it relates to the virus. And let's be clear, this isn't unique to the virus. When we look back over the decades, HIV, Ebola, what was that? The West Nile. You know, there's always the conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theorist. And my theory is that the internet and the technologies that we have today, our devices, now have given room and mobility to our conspiracy theorists in society that once was only limited to the talking heads. Remember Max Headroom, who interrupted a news broadcast? You know, all these road milestones and road markers for me in terms of time, in terms of technology, in terms of history, and how the introduction of whether it be history or technology or just information has resculpted how we view ourselves and ultimately our world. I said yesterday, the macrocosm mirrors the microcosm. On the outer level, we're all dealing with corona. We're all dealing with the world that's shifting, that's going back and forth between what's the right path and the wrong path to take, which ultimately is that agitated process that creates weather that will take us to wherever we plan to be in 22, 23, 25, etc. Some of us, unfortunately, won't be here in 21, 22, 25, etc. Contingent on what we do now, contingent on what you do today. And so that's why it's the gravity of stepping into your truth today is so important. It's a theme, a note that sages and gurus and even preachers have sort of rallied to for centuries. It's often been, the world is coming to an end. It's the apocalypse. You conspiracy theorists, and now it's not necessarily God or the apocalypse, but now the apocalypse is man-made, or the apocalypse is something of our own creation or our own, invention. And sometimes anything that they say, sometimes truth is scarier than fiction. So sometimes anything that we can create seems more real, more evident, than what's actually happening on the ground, for the very reasons that I said at the beginning of the show. Because the spirit realm is more real, more evident than anything that's really happening on the ground. So it doesn't matter what your belief is, what your conspiracy theory is or is not, as long as you're addressing the truths. And the truths are the virus. And the truths are how well you protect and care for yourself and your loved ones and the ones you love in the environment that is the virus. And understanding that then has global, worldwide implications, even for the most selfish person under the sound of my voice right now. So maybe you are only concerned about protecting yourself or your spouse or your pets. We hear cats now, more cats, house cats now have the virus, by the way, if you haven't heard that. So maybe you are only concerned about protecting your pets and your children and your household. But if you're still coming out into the world, if you're still going to the store, going to the gas station, going to work, and some of these non-essential career choices, then you're undermining your own plan, and ultimately that of a more global, much larger community by the choices you make. I used to say, back before all of this, I compared it to the cigarette butt. You might say I'm only smoking and it's only affecting me, but your secondhand smoke affects the next person. But even if I'm not exposed to your secondhand smoke, every artificial cigarette butt that you throw to the ground, it goes into my sewage system, goes into my water, goes into my oceans, goes into my rivers, goes into my streams. And so the macrocosm mirrors the microcosm. There's no way to get around responsibility. There's no way to get around stewardship. There's no way to get around taking authority over that which you choose to possess, but also that which you possess innately, inherently, divinely, or that which you have been gifted responsibility for, as is the case with some, children, animals, plants, the like. Come on, y'all. Let me have your questions, your comments, your request. I'm a little deep.
Voodoo occultism got his DNA test back.
Well, give thanks for that. Okay, he got the test back or the results. I'm going to assume we're talking about the results.
The results, I'm sorry. Yeah, the DNA test results.
Yeah, and when he has an opportunity, beloved, you probably can hear me, and you've gone through it, We'd like to hear some details. Now, if you haven't considered, this will be the time to get your ancestor work and divination done, for sure. You now have that technological footprint to follow and acknowledge, along with that which has traditionally been done by way of divination and through spirit. But now you have some proof for all you who need proof. Now you have some hardcore statistics, some hardcore numbers, some hardcore facts in which to operate from. And if you haven't done so already, you know, one act of homework leads to another. Make sure that someone else in your direct bloodline, in your direct lineage, also has some test results. So buy a test for your mother or your father, um, if indeed your parents are still living. A sibling, buy a test for a sibling, because remember now, every sibling does not contain every piece of the DNA puzzle. Some genes don't translate to every child. Just like diabetes can skip a generation, heart problems can skip a generation. So if you have siblings, absolutely get their DNA input as well. You'll find that to be really, really beneficial. And those of you who, you know, baby daddies, baby mamas, step families, half families, um, you might want to look into this. I said long ago that a side effect of the DNA lineage test is the parental test. And indeed, it's not exactly a shortcut too, but those of us who know we have half brothers and sisters, children outside the family by way of the father or the mother, if anyone in that family, if the child themselves, if the sibling themselves has taken a ancestry test, your crossroads will meet on these platforms. And I believe that's why Hoodoo occultism, if you go into your account, I'm not sure if you took 23andMe or Ancestry.com. I'm not sure which one you took, but if you go into your account, either one, there's a social component, a social media component there, where many people use their real names. Some people use usernames. Some people use a series of coded numbers and letters. Um, Even people that I know, I've got people in my family who I know exactly who it is, but they use some coded numbers and letters. For whatever reason, people are still wanting to sort of protect their anonymity. And I anticipate the time when there are so many people with DNA tests and DNA results, and active participation on these sites, that the racial and ethnic walls will have to come down. If not come down, at least the sheetrock is going to be pulled back from it, and expose opportunities for us to step through in terms of our knowledge and our awareness. That was one of the symbols that in the horror movie Candyman that stood out to me. The symbolism and the usage of the vagina or the birth canal. Sometimes it was a birth canal, sometimes it was the intestine, sometimes it was just a portal or an intra-dimensional doorway into another space. For those of you familiar with Candyman, you know what I'm talking about. Um, so the idea that knowledge, third eye opening, consciousness opening, um, leads just one destination, without indeed light falling on other things, on other arenas. It's part of the thrill to knowledge, to knowing, to gaining access to information, to studying. Kiona says that she lives in her head through daydreaming a lot. Um, People who live in the air do that. I do that. Well, I don't do it as much as I used to. I think because I've matured. spiritually. Um, and even with that, it's a bit of a misnomer. So let me reword that. Before, it was something that I was not in control of. And so we call that daydreaming. Um, when you become conscious in your dream state, conscious in your meditative state, um, lucid, and even in trance state, then that becomes much more guided, much more specific, much more directed to a specific location, a specific person, place, thing, subject matter. For instance, when you start utilizing that to go in and do your shadow work, for instance, it will take you back to those moments in time. And the more lucid you are, the more open your third eye is, the more real those memories are for you, which is what makes it so difficult for some people to do shadow work, because they don't want to feel, they don't want that sense I'm being traumatized or I'm reliving the moment. We use that kind of language all the time, and then still somehow disconnected from the actual process of doing spirit work, doing shadow work. And I often say, but your meditative or your prayer space, your quiet space is your safe space. But it's in the confines of that safe space that one consciously then goes back and walks through doing the work. Particularly the more traumatic it is, the more likely you are to discard anything helpful, useful, positive that might be within that event, within that moment, or even remotely connected to that moment. Because we then become consumed with the negative, the trauma, uh, the bad parts. And so we don't remember. I know there was a time, there were whole sections of my childhood I could not remember. There are whole sections of my childhood till this day my mother can't remember. Trauma has a way of and I don't want to just say trauma. Our body, I think, is even wired to um, assist us in all sorts of ways in the processing of information or the diversion of information that might harm us in some way, might be too much for us to handle in some way. And so we develop other ways of looking at or not looking at, whether consciously or not consciously, just to protect ourselves. So again, the idea that someone is conscious or spiritual or really actively doing their work suggests someone who's elevated to a place where they're mature, is the safest word I can think of right now. Mature enough to then walk through their dark side, walk through their shadow side, walk through some of the darker stuff, the negative stuff that indeed we like to push to the side and not think about anymore. That's what separates people with the conscious from those without one. People with the conscious, even if it's not outside their head, even if it's not being reverberated back to them from other people, remember what they do. Remember when they make a mistake. Remember when they're operating in their flesh, or when they consciously just chose to do wrong. People with a conscious, a conscious, a conscious, people of good constitution are going to walk right into that. But people who have no constitution or do not have a decent constitution and do not have a conscious, I need to be careful about my grammar right now and my word usage. They don't have that inner timing, that inner clock, that inner sensation. And that's why I'm put off by the whole concept of sort of self-initiation. Because if you are, not conscious, not cognizant, not able to self-view honestly, there's a such thing as body dysmorphic syndrome. It's when an individual sees themselves as larger or smaller than what they really are. And then it shows up as eating disorders, mental health disorders, other problematic symptoms in their life. So people have spiritual dysmorphic syndrome. And so people see themselves as holier than what they truly are, and people see themselves as full of darkness and full of sin sometimes, in an unjustified sort of way. People who are self-deprecating, and only think of themselves in the worst case scenario, let alone have that then be reinforced somehow from culture, from society, from what we see every day on TV, or then what we hear every day from within our environment and or our circle, in some sort of way. So be careful about not the amount of time you spend in your head, but the amount of time in your head spent committed to what? That would be the question. And particularly when the negative comes, the low emotion comes, the low energy comes, the stray stuff that comes, that's self-deprecating, that's chipping away at who and what you are. Know that you have the conscious opportunity then to re-steer that ship in a different direction. That's not the same thing as being in denial or avoidance of our shadow side either, or our shadow work. Sometimes that guilt is indeed not some necessarily trigger-based outside expression, but our interpretation of that outside activity or expression through our own inner filter. Oh, let's see.
I'm sorry, the next viewers want to know how you feel about a godparent being younger than you.
Oh yeah, I definitely wanted to respond to that question. I saw it, and then by the time I looked back, it was gone. In the best case scenario, and some of you have heard me say this over the years, we would not be disturbed. Your culture, your land, your people, your ethnic group, your background, your history, your gods, your ancestors would not be disturbed. So even in that modern context of that, particularly when we look at places like Brazil, not just West Africa, but in the New World, Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, and even in the US, when we see generational cultural practice and tradition, people being born generationally into a particular path and or tradition. So even if we're looking at Christianity, even if we're looking at Islam, we know child preachers, we know child soloists, we know child pianists and organists and minister of music. I was one. But we're talking about a child who then grows up hearing a certain thing. And even then, the child still has to sort of mature into that being really their identity. Because we then see a child at 12, 13, 14, 15 sometimes turn away from that upbringing, turn away from that background, or if not turn away from, set it aside for a minute and just want to experiment and or explore. So we're still talking about a level of maturity and unique individualness that has to come into play. Even as I answer that from an ATR perspective, I think about India and other cultures where you have child gods and child goddess. The Buddha, doesn't the Buddha reincarnate and move from human to human, representing reincarnations? And sometimes it's the child who is identified as the Buddha by way of certain characteristics, certain behaviors, certain traits, certain propensities, certain almost innate adaptations to certain things, but then there's still a training process. So when you use the words godparents, now you're being very specific. Now you're being Lukumi Santeria specific. They don't use that language in West Africa. They don't use that language in Benin or Togo. Not to say that there is no hierarchy, there is no order of procession. Indeed, there is. You always acknowledge your elders and those who came before. So any idea of sort of reversing or moving cards out of position is sort of Western. It's modern, and it's often in a modern context, which is why I referenced Hinduism. There's a goddess, escapes me right now. There's a goddess that's born through a child, and they basically take this young girl's childhood and even into her puberty. I think once she comes into puberty, she can no longer hold the position of this goddess, and then is sent back out into the world. But after being raised like royalty and treated like a goddess, you know, through your entire childhood, and now you're 17, 18, and you're out back into the real world, we find that these women have problems marrying. These women have a problem moving on sometimes with their lives in other ways.
Hello? Didn't you hear me?
So I still
Call
think,
on your phone.
I don't know why I can't,
Hello? There's a call coming in on your phone.
I don't know why I can't silence that. But yeah, so no, when we say Godchild, you're immediately pointing to some traditions. You're using code language. You not in, intentionally, but you're using a coded language for me that points specifically to particular traditions, particular paths. And so in that case, if you're born in Cuba, for instance, and you've been going to misas and bimbes and have seen numerous initiations and have sat, several times over, you might be qualified in terms of what your, ability, knowledge, encyclopedia of knowledge might be. Are you still mature enough in the position to teach older people who have lived and are living life aspects that you can't even read, you can't even envision? No, that would seem problematic to me. And again, just my trying to make sense of it goes back to what I said a moment ago about it being a sort of a Western notion. It's a Western notion that, wow, I'm just so powerful at 18, 19, 20 that I'm prepared to now mentor 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds about life. It doesn't make sense in an indigenous sense. Hoodoo occultism. I don't understand what you mean why they don't consider your indigenous family in America. It's too many open-ended.
He was talking about his like genealogy, like the lineage from when it came here, like after post-slavery. He's saying that they didn't include them, but wouldn't that be like genealogy, and wouldn't that be separate than ancestry DNA, perhaps?
No, if we're talking about ancestors, now you open up a political can of worms. Because now my Hebrew Israelites and my Moors and who are all on this sort of this indigenous, we were here first thing. We were not all here first. That's the first thing. Secondly, going more into your question, I asked a little while back, what tests did you take? And I didn't get a response, or I don't see the response, because that's also important to my answer. Depending on what test you took, specifics about indigenous bloodline and background are still in a state of evolution. Look at it this way. In the evolutionary, in the time span of the world, and we start talking about indigenous, we start talking about what's old, what's in the back of us, what was first, what came before. And Kiona said, and she might not admit to, but I heard post-slavery indigenous, and that's not quite the same thing as what I'm looking at when I see your question and what you're asking, and you asking me why it's not on your test. So many of you think you're indigenous American. Many of you think you have Indian hair. Many of you think, I mean, that's cultural. I'm not picking at you. That's cultural. That goes all the way back to slavery, when we were first taught to want to be and accept and identify with anything that's not black, anything that's not enslavable, for lack of better words. Okay, so the new concept that we're trying to somehow disconnect from our African ancestry is not a new concept. It's a concept, but it's not new. Now, let me make it just a little bit more personal, because I hear people saying, well, my grandmama said, and my great grandmama said, and no, my family said that we was indigenous. Well, so did mine. So did mine. So too did my family say that we were Indian. All my life, up until I, as the very first person in my family to take the DNA test, discovered less than 1%. And when I took the DNA test, we're talking 2007, they didn't have the number of copies. Copies is important for you to begin to understand Hoodoo occultism, because it is the number of copies that determine their ability to have something to compare our blood to, our lineage to. So that's why I said, in terms of timing, history, a timeline, when we say indigenous, when we say we were here before colonization, if you will, then we have to look at geographical locations, and ethnic groups. And the truth is that during slavery and then post, you know, there might have been some mixing, some marrying in, some partnering up, and we even sometimes overpronounce that to some degree. How much inbreeding, I hate that word, how much in-marrying, childbearing happened between quote unquote real indigenous folk and quote unquote African folk. And so we know through Mardi Gras Indian culture, through Maroon culture, that they assisted us in our journey. That doesn't necessarily mean that we married in or had children with. Everybody's story is not the yellow Pocahontas story. Forgive me, I meant the Pocahontas story, as it's told to us through Disney. So that's important to know. What I found, that what my family was saying was quote unquote Indian turned out to be Creole or biracial, before there was the word biracial, a mixing of indigenous, African, and European blood. So the amount of quote unquote indigenous blood may very well be heightened, may very well be overestimated in the conversation in your family versus what's really showing up in the DNA test. Now, let me say this. That was 2007. Then we saw the technology advancing, and particularly in most recent years, meaning them gaining access to more copies. And some folks don't understand that either. Well, my DNA test is changing, And how is that? Well, your test isn't changing. They're gaining greater access to more DNA. And this DNA can be acquired obviously by blood, but also through archaeology. When we're thinking about living generations that no longer live, um, um, time periods that no longer exist. We know we have Egyptian blood because it shows up in my 23andMe specifically. But that's because, I mean, who's done more DNA tests and blood research and DNA technology research than archaeologists as it relates to ancient Egypt? So yeah, ancient Egyptian is showing up readily and sooner in some of these DNA tests than indigenous is. We do have a certain population of indigenous Americans still living, but again, how many of us really have blood ties to those people? Let's keep it real. We like to point to the Olmecs and other Negroid, Afrocentric looking featured individuals, but they are often not the quote unquote Native Americans or indigenous Americans that we often envision. Another tweaking of the DNA test is that I noticed that, particularly with Ancestry.com, the map, because it has ethnic group and it has geology and then it has that map. And so previously, when it said um, Native American or not Native American, well, originally it did say Native American, and there was no map. And then it was Indigenous American, and then the map included everything from like as far north as you can go to like way south of Brazil, deep into South America. And then in the more recent months, I've seen it adjusted again on my map in particularly to now just a small portion of the southwestern region of the U.S. and a large portion of Mexico, and then a greater region that extends maybe to just beyond Honduras. So again, when we think indigenous American, that don't make you Apache, that don't make you Chickasaw, that don't make you, you know, any of these quote unquote Native Indian or Native American ethnic groups. Your indigenous blood could be south of the border. I know in my early years of study at the university level, when I studied Pan-African studies at the university level, that was my first awareness of the amount of African burial grounds in Mexico. When we go back in time, colonial, um, Middle Passage, enslavement, the largest numbers of slave burial grounds and remains in archaeology that we can find documented is south of the border in Mexico. I think that has to do with the large numbers of us that sort of processed south before coming into the cotton fields and the sugarcane fields and et cetera, here in the States, um, uh, in terms of culturally, not individually. The introduction of a particular crop or particular um, commodity in a particular region. But I also think that has to do with the lack of space and care afforded to slaves. We know that slaves were treated extremely differently in the U.S. as opposed to Cuba, Haiti, Brazil. Not that it wasn't brutal everywhere, not that it wasn't traumatic everywhere. But those of us who understand the history, who know the story, know that on a scale of things, some of the greatest acts of brutality took place in Brazil on just sheer scale of numbers, but then in the U.S. in terms of just the sheer scale of diabolical nature uh, and energy invested in the torture and enslavement and brutality. of our people. So again, there's many influences that would affect why you're not seeing it in your test, or you're not seeing a whole great deal of it in your test. And before you're so certain about it, again, I would have your mother or your father take the test, and particularly the side of the family that is pronouncing, this indigenous energy on you, that gives you for this sense that you should have this indigenous in your test. I wouldn't even go by facial features. My great grandparents on my father's side look indigenous American. By any stretch of the imagination, they look indigenous American. And they just aren't. They just aren't. And in fact, the paperwork that Ancestry.com is very good at, marriage licenses, birth certificates, death certificates, U.S. Census paperwork. Before my great grandparents on my father's side, my great grandfather's father was listed as white. Both he and his wife were listed as white, and all of their children, including my great grandfather, was listed as white. He didn't start showing up as black in any paperwork or any documentation until he married my grandmother. And again, I have their pictures. I got them posted in social media somewhere. They look indigenous. They look Indian, more so than how we identify black. I also think we've overused and over politicized to some degree black racial specifications like black, white, red, or which I despise that terminology, red, yellow, even Creole. What is Creole beyond a cultural nuance? Is it because when we start looking at ethnicity, we would call that biracial today. But when we look at it from a cultural perspective, language, culture, cooking, tradition, it will be a cultural nuance more so than a racial nuance. What makes being Creole different from being biracial today, from having a black parent and having a white parent today? Culture, your name, how your last name is spelled and pronounced, how food has been cooked in your family as a tradition, and how that then is passed down. So I would have to look at that from a very different perspective. Okay, you say you say your grandfather's family is from Oklahoma and all Native Americans. So again, where is your father's test? And if your grandfather is still living, where is his test? And again, I ask that because, forgive me, because even if they're from Oklahoma, does that make them indigenous just on the strength of it? And what about all the white people over the years? Not Elizabeth Warren, but over the years, who still to some degree profess indigenous or Native American ancestry. And in some cases, they can document it in their DNA test. In some cases, as with Elizabeth Warren, it's not showing up in their DNA test. So what makes her test any different from yours in terms of the authenticity of the Native American presence in your family, legitimately, in your blood? And I'm still not saying that it's not there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that race and how we've been educated about race is just so convoluted in the context of white supremacy. Not just when we're not talking about racialism. No, when we are talking about racialism, how we think about race, how we apply race, whether it's in our heads, whether it's in our hearts, whether it's in our minds, and then how that shows up on the outside. Um, I have a good friend, family member with a Hispanic name, first and last name. Spent most of her life disconnected from her real identity. Didn't even know, exactly where or who, her mom and dad and etc. were. Only to find out that she was raised black. I want to throw that in there. So she's always identified as black. She never accepted biracial. She never accepted Creole. She never accepted Hispanic. And then I convinced her to take the DNA test. Some of you all have seen the news broadcasted video on my YouTube page, only to find out that, okay, you're absolutely black and Puerto Rican. One of the very things that when I said it, she used a divination. She wasn't in a hurry to sort of buy into, oh, we just black. Well, we just black. And what separates Judge Joe Brown, whose name is Brown, from someone with a Martinez as a last name or a Perez as a last name. And even in how we pronounce Martinez. Is that Creole or is that Hispanic? Is that Latin or is that French? There's just so much convoluted understanding about race and racism and ethnicity that we also have to sort of weed through in trying to decipher who and what we really are, and particularly how it's showing up on these tests. Area code 347, is that Hoodoo occultism? Or are you 318?
No. How you doing? It's Brother Percy.
Brother Percy, peace and blessings. What's your question or comment today?
Well, the other day when we were on, someone else had a similar situation to mine about the dream of initiation and sacrifice. I just want to know, could you touch on it just a little?
You mean beyond what I said yesterday? I'm not understanding.
Well, I didn't really catch all of it yesterday. I was in transition after I got off the phone, so I tried to replay it back. And so I got a little gist of it, but you was like, don't take it for certain, you should still get a reading behind it or something. But yeah, I just want you to.
Yeah, because if you have no vocabulary, if you have no glossary to work from, to pull from, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're dreaming. And particularly when we try and then make it out to be about Orisha or Loa. And particularly when we're, as I described earlier in the show, not born of that culture, not born of that practice, not born of that tradition. And so, yeah, your subconscious mind is then throwing back to you the Orisha romance. Your conscious mind is then throwing back to you what you've been reading, what you're seeing, what kind of, movies you're watching. We are not born into or existing in a healthy enough environment, a holistic enough environment, an organic enough environment as it relates to spirit, and particularly these spirits that we want to then latch a name onto. Again, when we start talking about initiation, you're talking about something very specific. It's rare that I get, I'm dreaming fire, I'm dreaming smoke, I'm dreaming water. How does that show up for me? And then it speaks to initiation or something very specific about an initiation. I'm finding that with us, and this audience, and those connected to this audience, ATR and the Orisha romance, we want to learn about Orisha, study about Orisha, then dream about Orisha, and then make that leap into I must be dreaming about initiation. And the truth is, if you have not been initiated, you have no idea what goes on in the initiation. You just don't. You just don't. And any Eastern Star, any Mason, any Shriner under the sound of my voice has something to compare that to. You can read these books, you can watch these documentaries. You have no idea what's going on in the confines of those secret spaces if you're not there. You just don't. So a good author could tell you, it's this deity and it's this number and it's this color. And, I was going through my library earlier today, before I go to my next question. And I'm looking through my Google library, my Google books, and of course they're presenting suggestions of books, to read. Yoruba Ritual and Old World and New Africa's Ogun and just various different titles just jumped out at me. Hoodoo, Voodoo, and Conjure in African American Society, and many of these books I've read. There's one that's real popular right now that's making the social media circuit called African Cosmology of the Bantu Congo by Kim Bwandinde Kia Benseke Fu Kiao, PhD. And I read that in high school. That book is drawn from a document that was written in 1980. I graduated high school in 1984. So when I speak to you about overnight, about Orisha romance, about, not giving you full, complete answers, when people ask me, well, what book should I read? What's your book list? It's because too many of these books aren't giving you any new information, authentic information. If it is, aren't giving you authentic information. And if it is authentic, it's not new. And so they're coloring it, personalizing it, moving it around, painting it for a new, very enthusiastic audience, as is the case with African cosmology, which is only 20 pages long, too, by the way. It's only 20 pages long. I mean, it was created out of a university document, a university project that was being done, written, performed, and then it gained popularity, and now it's everywhere. But even when I look at it, beloved, they're not telling you anything. They're not telling you anything. There's some language in there that we're not used to because it's not Yoruba. Okay, so it's Congo, and we're not used to be Congo in terms of books. And I say that all the time on this show. The Yoruba are highly educated and prolific writers, and their national language is English. So we have easy access to that. We don't have easy access typically to Bantu languages, to Congo derivative linguistical systems, to Akan and Fan and Ewe and other languages. So this information then presents itself as brand new or exciting or just invigorating. Oh, this has got to be it. And I went through it. It's only 20 pages long. I went through it again. They don't even give you deity identifications. Now, he does make comparisons because one of the things that made him popular was his fluidity between Akan, Yoruba, and other Bantu Congo systems and traditions. But he's not giving you anything. He's not giving you anything. And if you don't know that, meaning if you haven't done linguistical study, archaeological study, cultural study about a specific people or group, then it's all French to you anyway. It's all Greek to you anyway. So, man, I feel like I'm answering two questions at once. No, someone younger than you, and particularly we're talking, if both of you are under 40, 50, no. This young God parents and young Ifa priests who don't live under this culture, who didn't grow up into this culture, who haven't had a lifetime to dedicate to just that, no. And the second part of that I was responding to, the caller just gave us that the more recent caller. Are you still with me? Okay, I guess not. Let me open my Blog Talk Radio so I can see. Kiona has her hand raised, but no one else. Hoodoo Occultism has his hand raised. So I'm gonna come to you next, Hoodoo Occultism. But I lost my train of thought. What was his original question? That's why I wanted him to still be on the phone. Kiana, what was his original question? That last caller.
I forgot the question, but I know that you were talking about like the godparent that's under 30, I mean, under 40 couldn't be
right. That
the godparent, and then you were talking about the Yoruba people being highly educated and how
yeah,
I actually forgot myself because I really didn't hear his question, to be honest with you, because I couldn't hardly hear him. He was kind of low on my end.
Yeah, I heard him and I heard him clearly in the moment. But again, once I get to talking and now I'm trying to pull back to the original question, I can't remember exactly how he worded that. And he's not on the phones anymore. Hoodoo Occultism, greetings, beloved. Thank you so much for calling.
The dream of initiation is what they're saying in the chat.
Oh, right. That's right. So if you haven't been initiated, you don't know what you're supposed to see. You don't know what you're supposed to dream. And you don't know what those dreams are then going to mean or equate to or symbolize. You're only comparing it to what you believe you know about Loa, what you believe you know about Orisha. And many of these powers don't manifest in human forms in the way that they're dramatized in these books at all. So, yeah, I hope I addressed your question adequately. But no, it's a slippery slope, dangerous slope to assume that one is being taken through an initiatory process or even being given instruction about an initiatory process without that process being involved. Area code 318, your mic is now open. Who's calling? Is that Hoodoo Occultism?
Yes, how you doing?
All is a blessing in yourself.
I'm doing okay. What I was saying is, now I'm not denying that, I have African ancestry. In fact, I know that a lot of the Native American or indigenous influence even migrated before, migrated to America before slavery. And that can be that can still be the reason why it goes back to Nigeria and Mali, because if anyone knows, if the Moorish people, they always have the talk about the ties to Mali and that Timbuktu area and stuff like that. But I was just giving you the percentages. Just wanted to let you know, really not doing no complaining. You know what I mean? I'm just worried about the research right now, trying to connect to my family. And you said, do my dad? I don't know my dad. You know what I mean? He never was in my life. So that's the reason why I did the ancestry test, to figure out who my father was and see if I have any sisters or not, because I don't have any sisters or brothers on my mom's side. So
you're throwing a lot out at me. Who knows who your father was?
Okay.
Who? You said since they know who my father was. Since who knows?
No. I didn't say. I said I was trying to. I did a DNA test to try to figure out who my father was. That side of the family.
Okay, now stop. If you don't know that side of the family or anybody from that side of the family, you'll start to see that in your DNA test based on relationship. Based on relationship. Now, if your mother's still alive, then you should have your mother take the test so that you can at least separate your mother's people, your mother's side of the family, from the relatives that are inadvertently going to show up as your dad's relatives. Let's be clear. The test that you're holding right now ain't a whole list of your mama's people. Your family's people, your dad's people absolutely are on that test. You just can't separate who they are if your maternal DNA has not been isolated. So if you don't have access to your dad, but you have access to your mom, then you need to test your mom and your mom's side of the family so that you at least have some jumping off point to then be able to separate one side of the family from the other. So that's why I said I had my mom take it. I had my sister Rapani take it. And I know that one of my half brothers and sisters took the test. So that also helped us to clarify my dad's portion of the test versus my mom's portion. But without that, you're still going to get you're still getting generalities. The more people that can take the test, that the better that helps your position in terms of identifying one set from the other set. Something else you said that threw me, not intentionally, but it just throws me every time I hear. Anytime they say the Moors, my brain freezes. Because again, just like Egypt, just like other aspects of our story, we've romanticized the Moors a great deal, and we aren't often willing to make a clear distinction when we start invoking the Moors between African culture and Arab culture. Now, much more apt to buy into and believe Moorish stories when someone has a Arabic footprint in their DNA, a Middle Eastern footprint in their DNA, an African footprint in their DNA, and then a Spanish or Italian even footprint in their DNA. How we then tie that back to the Americas is still a mystery to me. And it's not that I haven't heard, the explanations of how people have tried to sort of do that. I'm just suggesting it don't make any sense. And again, if we're connecting as originals here in the New World, then your bloodline would then be much more apt to be connected with the indigenous people who were already here, Mayans, Aztec. But even when we're looking at Cherokee and Omahas and other tribal ethnic groups, we now have modern archaeological demonstration that shows that trail across the Bering Strait or that footprint back to Asia. So why don't we leap to Asia Why don't we still ride the Eurasiatic, poem that or song that we sang back in the 70s and the 80s? That was popular in the 70s and the 80s. That we were Asiatic, that we had that Euro-Asian, Asiatic, Aryan background. That then led us to Egypt. That then led us to Kemet, which was also borrowing from most archaeologists' perspective too. That sort of the beginnings of the world, the center of the world, somehow came down from Mesopotamia and made their way into the mother continent, which goes against all archaeology. So I'm still not getting it, beloved. And I know you're not here to start an argument. You made that clear, and we're all still actively in the process of sort of learning and piecing it together. But in my opinion, in my best, most qualified opinion, if it's not showing up, it's not there, or it's in very limited quantities than what you all have been previously led to believe. Now, I would be really interested in seeing your DNA test myself. Funny, you got on the line and still didn't answer my question. You still didn't tell me who you had this DNA test performed by, what company performed this test. That helps me a great deal in knowing what you're looking at and in terms of what information is available to you. I'm often asked, which test is better or which test should I take first. They're all completely different in some ways. Ancestry.com is just not the same thing as 23andMe. 23andMe is just not the same thing as AfricanAncestry.com. And they don't all have access to the same number of copies in which they compare their blood samples to. Thereby, they don't all have the same information. 23andMe also is heavily focused on biology and chemistry and diseases and health issues and complications and characteristics that can travel generationally. Though they do a great deal of work as it relates to pure ancestry. Ancestry.com, on the other hand, does a great deal with ancestry, but also does a better job at paperwork. Again, those legal documents that show up as a footprint along with the DNA to help us to identify family trees and bloodlines. Okay, forgive me, I didn't hear you say ancestry, or I didn't see it typed. So yeah, you can look at your timeline in Ancestry.com and also determine where your bloodline or your lineage was at a particular time in or point in history. But if I'm not mistaken, with Ancestry.com, you can't go back any further than like 1660. If you go to the bottom of the page, there's a bar down there, a time bar, I believe, and it is 90 seconds. It's separated by decade, by year, and I don't think you can go back any further than 1660 in Ancestry.com. Whereas, which would be right in the middle of the middle passage. Whereas with 23andMe, because of that biological health component, it's something about that is allowing them access to older archaeological footprints, which is why they tied me back to ancient Egypt and tied some of my earliest living ancestors to Asia. Not Africa, to Asia. I understand there's a timeline of your family and how your family moved, how your family traveled at any given point in history. Then there's the movement of history itself. The Moorish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, colonialism, the move of the Catholic missionaries and colonizing of the world. You have to look at that history, and then compare that to your DNA results
10 seconds.
in order to even begin to get a clear demarker on many ethnic groups, and particularly ethnic groups that moved around or were forced to move around. So that also has to come into play in terms of making sense out of who your indigenous bloodlines are. I also find it curious, Keon, I'm looking at your Nigerian percentage and Mali percentage and Congo percentage. How many of this audience immediately goes to that African count, that African bloodline, and don't even want to talk about, don't even want to acknowledge the European and other ethnic groups that stand up in our chart. And it has everything to do with the traumas related to white supremacy and enslavement and the Middle Passage and lynching and Jim Crow and school busing and all the ways that footprint still shows up and still manifests today. But we all want to go straight somehow to that African blood, and often we want to go to that African royal blood. Let's talk about who was sold to whom. The Yoruba, for instance, sold many people into enslavement. Just enveloped many people either directly into their cultural way of doing things, or sold us off, transported us off into the Middle Passage. These are the kind of things that I would like to talk about. But I understand y'all scared. Y'all still worried about candle magic and tarot cards. But I get you. I understand. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing that. I was speaking matter of factly, Kiona, that generally speaking, we all are searching ancestry often for that indigenous connection or that African connection, particularly if you are a person of color, because of all the other toxicities that are associated with our understanding of race and ethnicity and who we are here in the West in particular. So I didn't mean you personally, I meant in general. Black people in general, people of color in general. I don't find that quite as prevalent with our Latin community, our Hispanic community. I think in many ways, even through the Middle Passage, their family structure is not as broken up, and they're content with the knowledge that they do have, that they do carry from generation to generation about their family awareness. And they're often aware generationally who great grandma was, in a way that we cannot. Jews can often do the same. Asians to some degree can do the same. Now, when we consider people who come from war-torn regions of the world, upheavals, political and global upheavals that bring them to America, even Asians, I find they too lack that information. Cambodians lack some of that information and are trying to recreate or rebuild their story. But that part which is whole, through the mother or the father or through their Asian ancestry, in terms of like Cambodia, for instance, as opposed to the veteran blood that might exist within them. We saw that same thing with Korean war and Korean occupation, and now back when Montel Williams was still on TV, the talk show host, Montel Williams, did a show I can remember where the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and were looking for their black and white veteran fathers, but their Asian and maternal lineage was held intact. Yeah, hoodoo occultism. I get that. I get that. Yeah, and I assure you, your position at 26 on many things will be very different at 36. Will be different more at 46. Will be the different even more at 56, and particularly when you consider what technology might be available by the time you reach that age. Give me your questions, your comments, your requests. Let me check my phone lines. It's well after 2 o'clock. Area code 610. You're fortunate to have stayed with me on the phone lines, so I can take your question, comment, or request. Area code 610. Your hand is raised. Who's calling and where are you calling from?
Hello. This is Tata from Pennsylvania.
Greetings, beloved.
Huh?
Greetings, beloved. Thank you for calling in. What is your question or comment?
Okay, I heard you talk about spiritual dysmorphic disorder, and I struggle with that. It's hard to like honor yourself, like force of habit. Like it's hard to like be proud of yourself.
Yes. What is your question?
Like, how can we view ourselves like in a positive and honorable light?
Well, there are many ways to address that, and we don't even have to. We can start mental health. We can start in terms of basic things that don't even cross over into voodoo or hoodoo or root work or conjure for that matter. We're talking about basic mental health, and particularly here in the West. I mentioned earlier on just the barrage of outside voices and influences, particularly with the internet, in terms of shaping and sculpting what a person may think or even believe about themselves. And it starts first at an extremely personal level. The younger you are, the more it's about your peer group or just your relationship to your friends and your parents and what footprint or imprint they might leave on your sense of self-esteem, your sense of value, if you will. But even for my older listeners who do come from broken backgrounds, broken environments, who are still going through a healing process, it starts first with your language, your inner language, and if you have to fake it, then you smile until you feel happy. You smile until you have reason to smile. You tell yourself you're going to be positive, or you're going to fix or repair or change how you view yourself or see yourself, until that absolutely kicks in for you. But then you have to be willing to do the work. And again, even without entering religion or spirituality, for that matter, what books you're reading, what amount of time and energy and dedication have you given to education, edifying yourself, feeding yourself in terms of knowledge. And I don't mean just, high school, elementary school, college. What information really do you know about yourself? And so keeping a journal, paying attention to your inner thoughts, paying attention to your inner language, your inner conversation, has everything to do with improving your sense of self, your sense of value, your sense of worth, in a world that often only reinforces the negative. And particularly social media. Social media is not that particularly positive, even when the post is positive, or the writer of the post might be positive, but then there's still that interaction with the rest of the community, you know, that tends to always look for a reason to analyze, or look for a reason to criticize, or look for a reason to sort of pick apart what's being said or demonstrated at any given moment. Even on the best of positive posts, there's someone who's not going to agree with it being a good day, who's not going to agree with it being a positive day, and so you expose yourself to that energy, to that toxin, often before we even leave our house, before we even pick up a phone or a device. It's everywhere in the world. Ideas about race, ideas about sex, about sexual identity, both negative and positive, are sort of reinforced at us, pushed towards us each and every day in unnatural, unhealthy, unorganic ways. Super ideas about positive affirmations that aren't real, that aren't obtainable, as well as the lower vibrating negative qualities that we reinforce through thought, or through what we say, you know, about ourselves. Um, Grandma used to say, and many of your grandmas did too, if you don't have anything positive to say, don't say anything at all. But that also applies to how we self-communicate, what we have to say to and about ourselves inwardly plays a great role as well. Give me your next questions, beloved. Please type them in all capital letters for me in the chat. It's too late for new callers to enter my phone line. Unless you're already on the phone, you can then press the number 1 on your telephone keypad, and I will be more than happy to open your mic and entertain your questions by way of those who are still and presently on the phone lines. I am also trying to scan the questions in the chat. Guinevere Reed has read numerous books from John Mason, Yoruba Cuban priest, Yoruba Cuban priest, lecturer, and author. I've read many of the books. I think to some degree, John Mason's books do contain some more structure, some more truth in them than some books that I might find comparable. And I'm hesitating right now because it's hard to sort of address this without calling out specific books, specific book authors. There's a competitive nature, not that you meant it, not that you implied it, but there's a competitive nature embedded in the question. As a book author, I have respect for Mason, and I've quoted other Mason books here on live on air. But I will say, as I say all the time, what books to read? I read all of them. Rightly, wrongly, good or bad, I read them all. You can't really begin to decipher for yourself the value of Mason's books if you have not read other things, if you have not been exposed to other things. And therefore you would be overly reliant on my opinion or other people's opinion about that particular book, that particular book author, that you know, particular individual's particular opinion about things. That's also why I mentioned earlier about how often do you read the introduction, the bibliography, the index, the introduction, those few pages that often precede sort of the bolts and nuts of a book. It often will give you truth about who these people really are, what their real motivation is for writing and or for writing that specific book or that specific title. Mason was more relevant at a time when there were no books, at a time where there were a limited number of books, um, and most certainly a limited number of books that spoke directly to us, or about us, or for us, or through us. I'm also cautious of the dominance of ATR-based books that are really Lukumi books or Santeria-based books or Orisha books, in terms of the African American, for instance, on a journey of self-discovery, and thinks that we do that through Yoruba culture, for instance, or through Orisha culture, but then cannot distinguish what's Yoruba culture from what's Latin culture, or what's Cuban, or what's Puerto Ricano, in terms of a cultural practice and or tradition. Many of those books, Mason books, Gonzalez Whipper books, use a lot of language in the book that, if you don't know any better, appears to be Yoruba and it's actually Spanish. Misa, for instance, there's no Yoruba word for Misa. There just isn't. And so someone who's reading her books or other Spanish authored Orisha books, and then sees that word, rogation, limpia, you're seeing Spanish words, Spanish language usage, Spanish cultural nuances that do not necessarily translate the same or equally into Yoruba specific, Yoruba, Nago Yoruba, West African Yoruba practice and or tradition. I learned that early on in my discovery of herbs, plants, roots, airway. You're quick to get Latin in these books, Spanish in these books, depending on how expensive a book you have, Yoruba. But they don't go out of their way to bring that into English often at all, often at all. So when you start Black Cat's tongue and using all these other coded words, Saint John the Conqueror root. Well, Saint John the Conqueror has been applied to more than one plant and more than one species of plant. So if you don't really know the difference, you still ain't getting it with any clarity if you're reading it straight, from out the book without any context in which to any context in which to back it up with, in which to compare it to. So okay, Guinevere Reed, you're saying a whole lot, but I'm gonna respond to just what I think is your question. What would I recommend for you? I would recommend getting godparents, and if indeed, I talk about this all the time, so this ain't me picking on you. But we hear every day as practitioners that my godparent died. We hear it all the time. We hear it all the time. In dates, decades, initiations, all of that has to line up for it to make sense. But in terms of what would I advise a young person to do, seek godparents. Seek living, breathing godparents. Preferably over the age of 35, 45 in the best case scenario, and then reacquaint yourself. Also, if you have godparents, godfather, godmother, etc., then they come from a community. So one wouldn't have a godfather and then be completely disconnected from the rest of that community. Who was his godfather? Who were his other godchildren? Who did they operate with in relationship to the practice, to the tradition, to the community? So I would seek out new godparents. I would seek out new elders who are living, who are qualified, who are prepared to teach and or initiate. Now, some of the people who are writing the books that you are right now invoking in the chat don't initiate. Louisa Tesh don't initiate. Louisa Tesh don't give readings. Louisa Tesh don't do work, and particularly for other people. She's written a very popular book. She's very active in the community. Louisa Tesh shows up in New Orleans once, twice, 3 times a year. But she's not actively operating an Elay. She's not actively operating a house. So you gotta seek people who are Danette Gibbs. I see you over the age of 50. I see you, and I might otherwise agree with you, but based on how I mapped it out earlier, if the person has done the work, you might find somebody at 40. You might find somebody at 45 if they've absolutely done the work, and the work is always documentable. It's always documentable. Yeah. So no, listen. Let me be clear. You're not going to find an active book writer, whether it's in Hoodoo, root work, conjure, E5. No, I'm going to take E5 back. Hold E5 off. But in almost every path, you're not going to find an active book writer living and relevant today who's actually practicing. Now, I hesitated when I said E5 because Araba Ella Baboon initiates, but Araba's in Oshogbo, Nigeria. He does have family, he does have a community that work back and forth between Nigeria and the US. But you're not going to study, work with him without going to Nigeria. It's just not going to happen. No one's going to say they're a godchild of Araba Ella Baboon or any of his Awos or Ianifas who's never traveled to Nigeria. So he would be an exception that I can think of off the top of my head. And there might be 1 or 2 who are a con. But again, you're going to travel to West Africa. There are none now living out of Haiti. None. Not one. Who's written books, who's qualified, whose books would even make sense to you if you don't speak Haitian Creole and can read it. No, you would have to seek out some living elders, living godparents who are legitimately actively involved in the tradition and have them take you on. And even in doing so, they are going to question your godparentage prior, any kind of hand or implement that you might, claim you have and want to bring along with you. Anyone new is going to want to qualify that. I went through it more than once. They're going to want to qualify that. And so it's not easy. No, it's not an easy process, but you can read several books. You can study with several people. But in terms of addressing that, who my godparents are question, yeah, that's going to have to be handled in real world time, beloved. So I'm willing to help you with that. Weird Mafia, how long have you been initiated? Oh, yeah. Weird Mafia. How long have you been initiated? Oh, yeah. Because that has everything to do with things breaking. And that's not necessarily a positive omen at all, especially from Oya. So I would need to know, how did you receive your Oya? I see you said I'm working with Oya, so I'm giving you the opportunity to to clarify that. When did you actively receive an Oya? And how are you necessarily tying the breaking of things to Oya? There are much stronger deities that stand up in things breaking, particularly if you're invoking Orisha. So things breaking would not be a good thing coming from Oya at all. So clarify that for me, beloved. Yeah, that's not a good sign. If Oya is breaking things or causing things to break, she may feel violated. Listen, no one can work with Orisha without relationship. It's like me not knowing you and claiming we're in relationship. And claim I should be allowed to go in your purse. I should be allowed to look at your purse. I should be allowed to go in your refrigerator. I should be allowed to go into your cabinets. So I would be very careful about associating the breaking of things with Oya at all. That's not good. That would not be good. If a godchild, an authentically initiated godchild of Oya told me that things are breaking, I would be very worried. I would be very alarmed. Very alarmed. So I've said on the show before, and Weird Mafia, I understand you might be a little bit new. Yeah, now your propensity to breaking things easily, that's something else. But that doesn't, again, forgive me, because this is a pet peeve of mine. I don't know what book y'all been reading, but the breaking of things has nothing to do with Oya. Mm-mm, mm-mm. So thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification, beloved. Yeah, that wouldn't be a good thing. Mm-mm, mm-mm. That wouldn't be a good thing. Sure, I'm here for you. Just send me an email, a private email. Um, there's some questions I want to ask you that is not would not be fair to ask you in a public forum like this. Um, and then I we'll figure things out. We'll figure things out. But be careful about suggesting that you're working with an Orisha that you don't have a real relationship with. That can be dangerous. That can be dangerous. Yeah, I'm not even sure what you mean when you. Oh, okay. You just the things that are getting broken. Yeah, there could be other things happening. You too could have a spirit attachment. It could be an aggressive ancestral spirit. It could be all sorts of other reasons why that could be happening, um, beyond just it being Orisha or even Loa for that matter. Because I get the same sort of response from others who believe that they, are having some sort of interaction with a particular deity. And I said it just before you came in. When you start saying words like Orisha, Loa, you're now speaking into a very specific language, a very specific tradition. And so there, in that case, then there are very specific things that translate across the board. Yes, Rob Stone, please send me your personal and private request. Keona has interjected the email address in the chat for you to reach out to me at Prince at houseofthedivineprince.com. Divine Prince at houseofthedivineprince.com. I am going to move forward. Thank you kindly, Kiona, for stating that and putting that in the chat for me. I need to eat. I need to replenish. I need to revive. And I look forward to being here with you again for another powerful rendition of Revolutionary Hoodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes on Monday. All is truly and indeed a blessing. Ashe, oh, ashe.
It's time to put something in your body.